He said it on a Thursday morning in September, standing in the doorway of the schoolhouse with his hat in his hands, watching her erase the day's lesson from the board with the kind of unhurried patience that made everything she did look like it had always been that way. He hadn't planned it. He'd come to fix the broken hinge on the window, the one that had been letting the cold in since August, and he'd done that, and he'd been about to leave. And then he'd looked at her, and the words came out the way honest things sometimes do, before the sensible part of a man could intervene. "You know, Iris," he said, "whoever ends up with you is going to be a fortunate man." She stopped moving. Her hand stayed on the board. She turned slowly and looked at him with an expression he had never seen on her before, open and careful and decided all at once. And she said very quietly, "I've been hoping that would be you." Iris Callum was 27 years old and had been teaching at the Harwick schoolhouse for 3 years. She had come to Harwick, Montana from Billings after her father's health failed and her mother needed help managing the house. She had taken the teaching post because it was available, and because it gave her a reason to stay, and because she was, by nature, the kind of person who found purpose in being useful. She was not what most people would have called remarkable at first glance. She was of medium height, with dark hair she kept pinned back during school hours and let down on Sunday afternoons. She had a stillness about her that some people mistook for coldness and others recognized correctly as the composure of someone who had learned early that most situations resolved better if you didn't add to the noise. She was funny in a dry, particular way that caught people off guard. She had opinions, well-considered ones, that she offered when asked and kept to herself when not. She noticed things. The first hard frost coming 2 weeks early, the Henderson boy struggling with his letters in a way that had nothing to do with effort, the way certain men in town talked loudly to fill the space where confidence should have been. The man who fixed her window was named Fletcher Grady. He was 31, and he ran a small horse operation on the north side of the valley, breeding and training stock for the ranches spread across the county. He was not a complicated man. He worked long days, kept his accounts honest, and had the kind of face that looked best outdoors, which was almost always where he was. He had been coming to the schoolhouse for 2 years whenever something needed fixing. The county paid him a modest fee for the maintenance work, which he did carefully and without complaint. He and Iris had spoken dozens of times. About the weather, about the children, about whether the roof on the east side was going to hold another winter. He had eaten lunch on her steps once when the repair took longer than expected, and she had brought him coffee without being asked. He had not, until that September morning, understood what he'd been looking at. The Harwick Harvest Festival happened every year on the first Saturday of October. It was the kind of event that small towns held on to deliberately, the sort of thing that gave shape to the year and brought everyone out of their separate routines and into the same temporary space. There were tables of food and a fiddle player and a caller for the square dances and a great deal of general goodwill that lasted, in most cases, right up until the apple pie ran out. Fletcher arrived in the early afternoon to find Iris already there, helping arrange the dessert tables with the easy competence she brought to everything. She was laughing at something the Reverend's wife had said. 3 men Fletcher didn't know well had found reasons to be standing near her within the first half hour. He watched this from across the grass with an expression he would have described as nothing in particular. He danced once with old Mrs. Taggart, who was 81 and still the best dancer in the county, and who told him without preamble that he'd been staring at the schoolteacher. "I wasn't staring," he said. "Fletcher." She turned them neatly around a younger couple. "I've known you since you were in short trousers. You were staring." He didn't argue with her. He changed the subject and got her a glass of cider and walked home later under a sky full of stars, thinking about it honestly. Iris Callum, his neighbor by 2 miles, his acquaintance by 2 years, capable, steady, quietly funny. Someone whose opinion he sought without quite noticing, he'd started doing it. Someone he looked for when he arrived at a gathering without admitting that's what he was doing. He stopped walking on the road outside his property line. She was someone he wanted to talk to every day. He hadn't known that until this exact moment. But now that he knew it, it seemed obvious. The kind of obvious that must have been true for a long time before he'd had the sense to look at it directly. He stood on the road for a while, listening to the horses move in the dark paddock beyond the fence, feeling like a man who had just walked into a room he'd been standing outside of for years. The broken window hinge at the schoolhouse had been on his list since July. He kept finding reasons to get to it later. He got to it in September, on a Thursday morning before school started, and he fixed it in less time than he expected, which left him standing in the doorway while Iris erased the board, and left him saying what he said, and left everything changed. After she said what she said, the room was very quiet. The morning light came through the new hinged window, the one he'd just fixed, and lay across the floor in a long rectangle, and the wood smell of the schoolhouse was around them both, and neither of them moved for a moment. Then Fletcher said, "Iris." And then, because he was a man who believed in saying the plain thing, "I meant it." She was still looking at him. Her expression had not shifted back to the composed version she usually wore. She said, "I know you did. That's why I said what I said." "How long?" he asked. She looked at the eraser in her hand, then set it down on the chalk rail. "Since last winter," she said, "when you came to fix the stovepipe and you noticed that Miles Hennessy was sitting too far from the heat and you moved the seats around without saying anything about it. I don't know why that was the moment, but it was." He thought about that. He had not remembered doing it consciously. He had just seen a small boy shivering at the back of the room, and it had seemed like the obvious correction. "I've been thinking about you since the festival," he said, "but honestly, probably before that. I was just slow." "You were," she said, and there was her humor in it, that dry and unhurried quality, even now. "Can I come call on you properly?" he asked. "I'd like to speak with your father." She picked up the eraser again and turned back to the board, but she was smiling. "He likes you," she said. "He's been asking me for 6 months why you don't come around for supper." Fletcher stood in the doorway for a long moment after she turned away, feeling the specific and unfamiliar lightness of a man who has narrowly escaped something he would have regretted for the rest of his life. Her father was Iris Callum, 64, with a bad hip and a good mind, and the kind of quiet authority that came from having earned everything he had and lost some of it and rebuilt it anyway. He was sitting on the porch when Fletcher came the following evening, which meant Iris had mentioned something, which did not surprise Fletcher in the slightest. They sat looking at the last light on the mountains. Fletcher said what he had come to say. Edmund was quiet for a moment, then he said, "What took you so long?" Fletcher looked at him. "I'm asking that question myself." "Iris doesn't complain," Edmund said. "She doesn't ask for things she doesn't need, but she deserves a man who pays attention, who sees what she actually is, not just what she does." "I see her," Fletcher said. Edmund looked at him for a long, unhurried moment. Then he nodded once. "She teaches until 3:30 most days," he said. "Supper here on Sundays. Her mother sets a good table." The courtship moved the way things move in ranch country, around the edges of work, in the spaces the day allowed. Sunday suppers at the Callum house. Saturday evenings walking the road between town and the valley. 2 or 3 mornings a week when Fletcher found legitimate reasons to pass the schoolhouse at noon, and Iris found it perfectly natural to have her lunch on the steps. He brought her a book he thought she'd like, A History of the Northern Plains Territories, because she'd mentioned once in passing that she couldn't find a copy anywhere in the county. She read it in a week and left it on his fence post with a note that said simply, "Thank you. You were right about the chapter on the Mandan villages." She taught him to play chess one evening in November when the weather kept them inside. He was not good at it. She was patient in the particular way of someone who genuinely enjoys watching a person improve, rather than someone enduring their failures. He got better. She told him he thought too much about protecting and not enough about position, which he suspected applied to more than chess. He repaired the gate on the Callum property without mentioning it. Edmund shook his hand 2 weeks later with the grip of a man who understood exactly what had been communicated. And then, one evening in late October, Something happened that Fletcher never told Iris about. He was walking the road toward the Callum house for supper, the dark coming down early the way it did in October in Montana, the first real cold of autumn in the air, and he stopped. Not because anything was wrong, because something was right, and that frightened him in a way that nothing wrong ever quite had. He stood on the road and looked at the lights of the Callum house ahead of him and understood with full clarity what he was walking toward. Not supper, not a pleasant evening, but the thing itself, the wanting, the real kind, the kind with weight to it. The kind that, if it went wrong, would leave a mark he could feel for years. He had stopped wanting things directly a long time ago. After his partner, a man named Wes, had gone under in a bad winter 4 years back and taken half their joint operation with him. After that, Fletcher had gotten good at wanting only what he already had, at keeping his expectations flush with the ground so there was nothing to trip over. This was different. This was wanting something he didn't have yet, something that could be lost. He stood on the road for a while. Then he walked forward anyway. Iris opened the door before he knocked. She always heard him on the gravel path. "You're late," she said. "The biscuits are getting cold." He stepped inside into the warmth and the lamplight and the smell of supper and thought, this is what I almost talked myself out of. That winter was the first one in years that Fletcher didn't mind. Not because it was easy. Montana winters were not easy, and no amount of feeling well in your personal life made the temperature rise or kept the pipes from freezing, but because there was something steady behind the difficulty now. A reason for the work beyond the work itself. He built things that winter, fixed the Callum woodshed properly instead of the temporary patch that had been holding since the previous spring. Replaced 2 fence sections on his own property that he'd been putting off. Put in a second water trough on the south side of the paddock where the horses always crowded in the cold mornings. He did not tell Iris about the trough. He just knew she would eventually come to see the operation in full, and when she did, he wanted the place to be what it was capable of being. What love looked like when it didn't announce itself was a man pulling extra fence posts in November with no audience and no expectation of credit. It just did the work because the work was for something now. He asked her in December near the old stone bridge on the creek road that ran between his property and the valley. He had thought about something more elaborate. There was a ridge above the tree line with a view of the whole range on clear days, spectacular at sunset. But when the moment arrived, it didn't feel right to dress it up. The stone bridge was where they had first walked together, back in the early days of October when everything was still careful and tentative, and it seemed right to return. The creek was low in December, running cold and clear over the flat stones. The mountains were white above the tree line. Iris had her coat collar up against the wind and her hands in her pockets, and she was looking at the water with the small private expression he had come to recognize as thinking. He stopped walking. She noticed and stopped too. He turned toward her and said what he meant, plainly the way he had learned she preferred. "I know I took my time," he said. "I know it wasn't always obvious that I was paying attention. But I was. I've been paying attention for longer than I knew." He paused. "I want to keep paying attention every day. I want to build something with you, Iris. A home. A life that's ours." He reached into his coat pocket. His grandmother's ring, a narrow gold band with a small dark stone he had always liked for its plainness. "I would very much like it if you would marry me." She looked at him for a long moment. The creek moved below them. The wind moved through the bare branches along the bank. And then she said, "Fletcher Grady, you took long enough." "Is that a yes?" "That is absolutely a yes," she said. He put his grandmother's ring on her finger there on the stone bridge over the December creek. She looked at it for a moment, just briefly, with an expression that was not about the ring, but about what the ring meant, about the particular weight of a thing chosen deliberately. Then she looked up at him, and he kissed her for the first time with the cold wind around them, and the mountains standing over everything, indifferent and permanent and beautiful. The wedding was in April, on a Saturday when the snow had finally let go of the valley and the first green was coming up along the creek banks. Half of Harwick came. Iris wore a dress her mother had made, ivory wool with simple stitching at the collar, and she walked to Fletcher with her father on one arm and her face clear and certain, and Fletcher thought, "I cannot believe I was that slow." Edmund's voice broke slightly when asked who gives this woman, which set off a sympathetic reaction through several rows, and at least one of the ranchers in the back who had known Edmund Callum for 30 years and would deny it to his grave. Iris said her vows, looking directly at Fletcher. They were for him, not for the room. He said his the same way. Then they were married. Old Pete on the fiddle played until the food was gone and passed it. People danced on the church hall floor until the lamps needed refilling. And that evening, in Fletcher's house, their house now, though Iris hadn't seen all of it yet, she stood in the kitchen and went still. She was looking at the south window. The kitchen had always had one window, facing west, which meant the afternoons were bright and the mornings were dim. Sometime in January, Fletcher had put in a second window on the east wall. He hadn't told her. He had just done it. "You did this," she said. "I did." "Why east?" "So you'd have good light in the mornings," he said. "I know you read before school. I thought you'd want it." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she crossed the kitchen and took his hand the way you hold something you intend to keep. "Thank you," she said. 3 words. No flourish. He understood she was not thanking him for the window. She was thanking him for what the window meant, that he had thought of her in the deep of winter when she wasn't there yet and made something ready for her arrival, that he had seen her, specifically her, and built accordingly. That is what love looks like when it doesn't perform itself. It just quietly faces east and waits for the morning to come. The years that followed were built from ordinary days and honest labor and the particular richness of 2 people who choose each other without reservation and keep making that choice through all the ordinary difficulty of a life. The horse operation grew. Iris taught for 2 more years after the wedding, until their first child made the logistics difficult, and then she ran the books for the operation because she was better with numbers than Fletcher, and they both knew it, and neither of them found this complicated. She also organized a seed lending arrangement among the valley farms for difficult seasons, a practical idea that she had without fanfare, that people would talk about for years. Their first child was a girl, born in the 3rd spring, with her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness. They named her Lena for no particular family reason, simply because it suited her. Fletcher said the stubbornness came from Iris. Iris said the stubbornness came from Fletcher. Both of them were correct. Their son came 2 years after that. Edmund for her father, who had lived to hold him twice before the bad hip made the ride to the valley too difficult. The boy had his grandfather's quiet and his mother's humor, and was, from an early age, the most observant person in any room he entered. On a Thursday in the autumn of their 5th year, Fletcher had decided Thursdays were significant. He was at the stone bridge, checking the lower fence line after a week of rain, when Iris came down the path with both children, Lena running ahead, Edmund toddling behind with tremendous determination and limited coordination. She raised a hand when she saw him. He climbed the fence and went to them. Lena immediately demanded to be put on his shoulders. Edmund, with the absolute conviction of a 2-year-old who recognizes injustice, demanded the same. A negotiation was conducted. Ultimately, both children were accommodated, which required a specific and undignified arrangement that neither adult commented on. Later, when the children had exhausted themselves and were leaning heavily against their parents in the last of the afternoon light, Iris rested her head against his shoulder and said, "I've been thinking about that 1st September. The schoolhouse. What you said." "What about it?" "You said whoever ended up with me would be fortunate." "I did." "You were right," she said. "She is very fortunate." He looked at her. "I'm the fortunate one." "We're both fortunate," she said in her practical way. "There's no reason to argue about it." "We're both fortunate," he agreed. The mountains held the last of the October sun on their high ridges. The creek ran clear over the flat stones the way it always had. Harwick Valley went on being Harwick Valley, wide and cold and demanding and quietly beautiful, full of people trying to build lives worth the building. And Fletcher Grady stood at the stone bridge with his family in the autumn light and understood, with the full weight of a man who knows what things cost, what he had almost let himself miss. He had been slow. He had stood on a dark road and nearly turned around. He had spent years keeping his wanting at ground level so there was nothing to lose. And then he had walked forward anyway. That, it turned out, had made all the difference. There are people in your life right now who are that kind of close. The ones you see regularly, speak to easily, whose absence you would notice before you ever named why. Most of us are slower than we should be. Most of us have our version of that dark road, that lit window ahead, that moment of deciding whether the wanting is worth the risk. It is. It almost always is. Don't stand on the road too long. I keep thinking about Fletcher standing on that dark road. The lights of the Callum house were right there in front of him. Supper was waiting. Iris was inside. Everything he wanted was a 5-minute walk away, and he stood there for 10 minutes anyway, because wanting something real is genuinely terrifying in a way that wanting nothing never is. I recognize that road. I think most of us do, if we're honest about it. What strikes me about Fletcher isn't that he was slow. It's why he was slow. He hadn't stopped caring. He'd stopped letting himself care openly because he'd learned, the hard way through real loss, that wanting things directly meant you could lose them directly. So he kept his wanting quiet, kept it at ground level, made himself useful without making himself vulnerable. Fixed the window, fixed the gate, showed up and helped and never quite said the thing. That's not cowardice. That's what happens to people who have been through enough to know what loss actually costs, and understanding that changes how I see his story entirely. Because what Fletcher ultimately did, what took real character, was walk forward anyway. He stood on that road and felt the full weight of what he was risking, and he went toward it. That kind of decision doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from having built, over years, the kind of integrity that makes you trust your own judgment, even when you're afraid. He was a man who kept his word, paid his debts, showed up when he said he would. That foundation is what made it possible for him to take the harder step when it mattered. And then there's Iris. She had known for a year. She carried it without bitterness, without performing it for anyone, without engineering situations to force his hand. She just lived her life clearly and honestly and waited for him to see what was already there. And when the moment came, when he said that careless, earnest thing in the schoolhouse doorway, she answered honestly. She could have deflected. It would have been easier. Instead, she said the true thing, which took more courage than anything Fletcher did at that window. What I take from their story is something I'm still working on myself. Good things, real things, tend to arrive quietly. They don't usually announce themselves. They show up in the form of someone you already know doing ordinary work in ordinary light, waiting for you to look up long enough to actually see them. The intelligence to recognize that, to tell the difference between what's valuable and what's just loud, that's something you have to cultivate. It doesn't come automatically. And then you have to do something with what you see. You have to be willing to stand on the road, feel the fear, and walk forward anyway. Fletcher built that east window in January, alone in the cold for someone who wasn't there yet. That's the thing I come back to. He saw her clearly, and then he acted on what he saw quietly, without an audience, without any guarantee it would be received. That's what it looks like when all three things come together, knowing what's right, seeing what's true, and doing the work regardless. Don't stand on the road too long.